Hi, welcome to the National Fireman's Journal. I'm Halton, and I'm here with my good buddy Danny Sheridan. Danny works for a large metropolitan fire department located somewhere on the eastern seacoast between the great state of Long Island and the state of New Jersey. We won't disclose the name so we don't break any social media policies. And we're using social distancing right now. I'm in the great state of Oklahoma, and Danny right now is in the another great state. Yeah, right. Danny's getting ready to rob a bank. So we hope you're all doing well. I mean, this is crazy times. We're dealing with all the Wuhan virus stuff here. So life goes on, right? We still keep fighting fire, which is what we do for a living. So we're here to talk about fighting fire and not all the rest of that stuff that's going on in the world today. So Danny, welcome to the National Fireman's Journal.
Thank you,
Great to have
Bobby.
you on board, bro.
It's an honor to be here.
So we were talking the other day, Danny and I were talking about, I think we were talking about top floor fires and finding fire. We were talking about both of them. We were talking about finding fire, locating fire, and we're also talking, we'll get to top floor fires in a little bit. But you had some thoughts about, you know, Danny's a battalion chief, does a lot of work, he's got a lot of history. He writes a lot for fire engineering and with New York firefighters. And so, we're talking about locating fire. And I think that's really important because nowadays, tight buildings, skin fires, we're seeing a lot more skin fires where we've got combustible exterior clatter. The people in the UAE have made that, and Greenfield made that like cause celeb these days. But we also have that stuff in the United States. We've seen that with the combustible siding on a lot of the older Queen Anne's, Queen Vic's, balloon frame, which is always a big deal. But we also see it in commercial buildings and other types of residential buildings. So Danny, what are some of you and I were kicking around some stuff on, how to find fire at a building, how to locate fire at a building and some of the things to look for. So what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah. I'm a big advocate of doing a good size up, I I listen when I'm at work. Guys, they call us a buff because I listen to the scanner, and they don't realize. I got annoyed. Well, one of the guys was being funny. I think he hid the scanner on the other chief, and I told him. I said, listen, you don't realize it, but it's critical for me to know what's going on in my battalion. Right? I listened to the radio traffic, and years ago, before we had computers, everything was on the radio. The dispatchers would call the units, and everything would be verbalized because they would go from call to call, and you get all this information, and now we're working in a like the what's that word I'm looking for, them undercover stealth mode, because everything's on the computer, and once in a while, the dispatchers, if they got something good, they'll shout it out on the frequency and give the chief some heads up on what's happening. And for me, I seem to have this sixth sense. Like I know, like when the dispatchers are getting a lot of calls because you could hear it in their voice. They'll be like, we're calling a battalion. You're getting numerous calls. We're loading up the box. And it gets everybody in that right frame of mind, so you got to listen to what's being said on the radio. You got to take all the clues, and it really, when I talk about doing size up, it's really contingent on the type of construction. Like, a private dwelling, 2-story private dwelling is way different than a 20-story high-rise fireproof multiple dwelling, and that's the challenge, right? Because I have factories, I have, high-rise multiple dwellings, I have non-fireproof class 3s, type 3 buildings. And, you pull up and sometimes it's not evident, and, I posted this one day. I put this on the Twitter. I said, no matter what the weather, I always have the window open, right? Because, we have this sense right here, right? The nose. And sometimes, I pull into the block and I could smell it. I know something's going on, and you know that smell, right? It's got that kind of bite to it. It's like wood, So for me, it begins way before I get to the scene. I'm getting all the information I can, and when it comes to the high-rise fireproof multiple dwellings, inevitably we're going to get a lot of calls. Generally, on any kind of incident that I have in a high-rise, I'll get at least 7 to 8 calls. before I even get there. And I have to start using some logic, right? I listen to the wording. If the dispatchers are saying smoke in 4F and smoke in 5G, and then fire, they say the word fire in 3G, then that's where I kind of, that's the bar now. Like that's where we're not going any further than 3, you know. But it's really critical for us to locate the fire, because we really can't do anything until we know where the fire is, and all sorts of problems can occur. Short stretching, overstretching, stretching to the wrong place. Um, you know, I've heard some horror stories in other places about, guys not locating the fire, and you'd laugh if you heard some of the things that went on.
Oh, where's the fire is a big deal. I mean, because you have to have that starting point, right? And a lot of
Right.
things can affect it. So no, I'm right there with you. I had a fire in a nursing home one time, and it was a big complex, right? And the first two guys got there, and they said, "We got smoke in the area, but you know how like sometimes the smoke just kind of hangs down there." And I'm like,
Mm.
"But we don't know where the hell it's coming from, right?" So they were smart guys. Right away, they went to the laundry room, and it turned out to be a dryer. A lint fire got up in the dryer. They're pretty smart characters, so they were able to find it fairly quickly. But the only reason they did that was they were familiar with that building,
Right.
and they just got that sense that the smoke was, that lint fire smoke that you get, that, you know what I mean?
Right.
The guys were, and I think it was this too, you hate to say it, but nowadays, to say using the sense of smell. I know some people, oh, that's crazy, you can get cancer. Oh, yeah, okay, I get it, but the sense of smell is still useful, especially from a good distance. We're not talking about not wearing your mask in a fire, when you got smoke. When you're trying to locate fire, it can really help you out. Plus, there's that, like a ballast, you know.
Yeah.
That, you get people in a building, they smell smoke. It's a ballast, it's not caused to evacuate a building or shut down a factory. You find the ballast, right?
Right.
So anyway, no, I agree. So you listen to the size up, listen to what everybody's saying. So say
Right.
you get, and it's happened to me, it's happened to everybody who's ever fought a fire. You get two different, different opinions from two of your troops. Like, hey, the fire's in the basement. No, I've got fire on, or I think it goes to the line. I think, if a guy says or a gal says, I've got fire, you can trust that. When they say they got, that means they're seeing it, they're dealing with it. But when
Mm.
somebody says, hey, I think, and you got two people saying, I think, right? And
Mm.
it's early on in the alarm. What do you do then? And they're both, both and they could both be right, but how do you kind of work through that? You got two reports coming to you from
Mm.
two good officers.
Yeah.
Where are you going now?
Sometimes I'd be honest with you, it's dumb luck, but maybe it's not luck. I think I wrote an article for the magazine. It was a hospital fire. It came
Okay.
in as just a street box. It was a pull box. I was just covering there for the day. It was a battalion that I never really worked in. I worked there as a lieutenant many years before that. And talk about listening and sizing things up. I was kind of, what's that word I want to say, complacent, you know, street box, middle of the day. I didn't think much of it. We got in the car, and probably about 30 seconds into the ride, the dispatchers got on, and they're like, all right, Chief, listen, we're getting reports of smoke in the emergency room from EMS. That's credible for me. That's very credible. So now I'm focusing on the emergency room, right? So now I'm thinking about the hospital and emergency room, and why is there smoke in the emergency room? And so we pull up, first units came in. I got up to the street. The whole block was like, you couldn't see anything. It was like a cloud that just covered the block, and the people had evacuated. And I gave this report. I said to this guy, Bobby, he was the dispatcher, I said, I don't know what I got, but I'm using all hands. That's all I said. And he was really heads up. He saved my ass that day. He gave a second alarm. He gave a code for a high-rise fire, But I got a report from one of the guys, and he said, Chief, it's just rubbish in the shaft. And I don't know what possessed me to discount it, but I I respectfully okay, thank you, 10th floor, and I acknowledged it, and I didn't act on it because I knew it wasn't. And I don't know what prompted me to disregard that, because maybe other guys might have just, like said, okay, we'll go with it. It's just a rubbish fire. Meanwhile, the cogen, the generator's huge room in the basement was rocking and rolling, and it wasn't until maybe a minute after that I hear this report, because I like to listen to everything. And I heard the officer from the truck company call his chauffeur, and he said, ladder 1 to chauffeur, he says, get the search rope. As soon as he said that, I knew we had a serious situation, So I don't know. Sometimes it's luck, sometimes it's gut, sometimes it's knowing the officers. Like what I do every tour is we put out a riding list, and I look at the officers, and I have a guy, 30-year captain, and if he tells me, hey, chief, we got a food on the stove, hey, call dispatch, it's a food on the stove. I have some officers that have just promoted less than a year. They came from places that may not be as busy as, some other places. And I have to give some pause, I hate to be a micromanager. I don't know where that line is between micromanaging and being concerned, but I might start asking more questions. Like, I might call the other truck. Like, did you check the floor above? Did you open up the wall? Did you feel the wall? There's more questions there. So I think in answer to your question is, I would first look at their experience level, and their tone of voice too. I think I can tell, like, if a guy is giving me a report and he's kind of questioning it, he's not really sure, and when someone's dead sure, like they got something, like, hey, chief, we need a line up here. We got fire on on the 3rd floor. So
I think that's a really good point too, because it's knowing your folks, right? Knowing your people. It doesn't mean that you discount anybody, because sometimes a gal can come from out of nowhere, a guy can come from out of nowhere and just surprise the living heck out of you with great information and great work. And oftentimes, an A-list, officer or firefighter can have a bad day, right? So I was remembering while you were talking about your hospital fire, and I got a good hospital fire story for you in a bit too. Where we had the autoclaves. They use a special gas in those autoclaves. It's like the flammable range is like from 0 to 99.9, right? You can't get anywhere near this garbage. We had a fire in the storage area for that one night, which was a wild fire, really crazy story. But anyway, the other story about trusting your people, I pull up on a church fire one night, and it's a kind of how they build complexes around the churches sometimes. So it's the largest or the oldest church of the Latter-day Saints in the city of Albuquerque. It's a historical landmark, a big building, right? Big church, and a couple of they had other things going on there, right? So I roll up, it's like 1 o'clock in the morning, cruisers stretching lines, grabbing plugs, and the initial crew goes in, and it's a guy named Chris Chavez, a lieutenant, great guy, smart guy, comes back to the buggy in his gear, which is unusual. He'd gone in with his crew looking for the seat of the fire, and you could see some light smoke coming out of the belfry area, right? And he says to me, he looks me right in the eye and says, "We can't do this." I'm like, "You better tell me some more, because I'm right off a building with light smoke." And he goes, "We went up. It's a spiral staircase to get up those stairs, Chief, to get to that loft." He said, "We got halfway up, and I told my guys to get out of the building." I said, "What the heck, Chris?" He goes, "I don't know. Something ain't right." And I'm like, "You don't know, something ain't right. We're going to write off this building." He said, "There's a lot of heat in there, and it doesn't make sense because the smoke's above us." And he was right as rain. An arsonist had lit a fire in the basement, and a big fire in the basement. We weren't seeing any of that because he lit the fires at the same time, and he vented the one at the top. And so this guy knew what he was doing. And this officer, Chris Chavez, man, he couldn't put it all together, but he put it all together. You know what I mean? In other words, he couldn't explain why we couldn't do this, but he was flat out right. And I was like, okay, well, let's set up for defensive. And I had people looking at me like, are you out of your freaking mind? You know what I
Wow.
mean? And luckily Chris called the ball, and I don't know, I'm going to say 10 minutes later, I could be lying, I don't know, but shortly thereafter, that goddamn floor gave out.
Oh,
And if I'd had people in there, it could have been a really bad day for a lot of people. And so, you gotta know your people, like you said. You gotta know who you're working with, who's on your shift that night. And then
yeah.
sometimes if you don't know, like say you have a covering officer rolls in, and you don't know the guy. What do you do then as a chief officer? Go visit?
Yeah, that happens. You know what? We played this game in the firehouse, and I'm sure it happens everywhere. Is that guys are good. Like the guy shows up for the first time, it's like you get the put him in the chair and the bare bulb over his head, and give him the third degree. Like, so all right, so where did you work? And this, because the guys want to know. That guys want to know, and it doesn't take very long, especially in a small, even though you could work in a big city, even a small area like a certain battalion or whatever. Like if a guy is not all he should be, the word gets out very quickly. Because this is the kind of job where you can't fake it. Like you could fake a lot of jobs, but this guy in my old company, I remember he told me, he says, when you're on that fire escape, it's between you and God. It's like, and I've seen a lot of stuff on the fire floor, guys, like big beating the chest and this and that, and sometimes they're nowhere to be found. So that stuff comes out in the wash pretty quickly. I don't really have to really worry that much about, like, you can't hide. This is a job you just can't hide. You're going to be found out very quickly. So I kind of let the guys figure that out, and it usually gets back to me. You'll know very quickly because I already hear. As soon as the guy, even where he was before, will carry with him. Like, hey, watch out for this guy. He's might not be found. So kind of that's the good thing. With the gossiping, even though I'm not a big fan of it, but sometimes it's helpful because. And I try to give everyone a shot, like, but
Yeah, because sometimes it's dead wrong too. You know what I mean?
yeah, yep,
Like, and lots of times it's because the guys got jammed up and by the guy, right? Especially with an officer,
yeah,
especially with chief officers. You roll into a house and they can't stand this guy,
yeah,
and you're like, okay. An old guy that I work, Art Luero was a great guy. This old guy, Art Luero, I worked for. He was an old Marine out of, I think he did 2 tours in Nam. He's about 10 years older than me, and so he was in, Nam in like 64 and 62, and I mean, this
yeah,
guy was, hard as nails. And he gave me a good piece of advice as a young, me and a bunch of other probies. He said, pick your own assholes. You know what I mean? And it goes, just because a guy's an asshole to this guy doesn't mean he's going to be, not a great guy to you.
right,
And don't put too much credit in other people as a source about anybody's ability, character. And the other
yeah.
thing he said is that, just because a guy doesn't look like Superman,
Oh yeah,
doesn't mean he's not. You know what I mean?
oh yeah, yeah,
Because we
yeah,
had some great. I worked with some great guys who were, quiet as hell.
yeah,
But when it got ugly, that's the guy you wanted to be standing next to.
yeah, yeah. I've worked with guys like that too, and they shock you, because it's so quiet. But
So let's talk a little bit about um, stretching and estimating stretches, because you do a lot of you lay out a lot. You do a lot of work with hand lines, and you lay out from a lot of standpipes. And
mhm.
so what are some of the keys that you do when you get a young troops? You guys just graduated a class, so I'm sure you've got a lot of people riding that are brand new boots out there on the ground. How are you getting them used to guesstimating stretches? How are you getting them used to figuring whether or not because you don't do a lot of pre-connect
Mm-mm.
where you live. A lot of people do, but oftentimes you need to do a lead line and pull some some loads and stretch from there. But so how do you how do you work it in your system to get people up to speed?
Right. Yeah. Well, it's been a while since I've done that, but I remember, I was a captain in a very good engine company, and a great um, lieutenant in a another great engine company. And one thing that we do in my department is that we only carry 6 lengths of inch and 3/4, and then we fill it out with 2.5. Now there was one captain wound up becoming a deputy chief, Jimmy Campbell, and he was ahead of his time, and he liked to have only 4 lengths of inch and 3/4, and the rest 2.5. And his logic was that you're never gonna have more than 4 lengths in a building, which okay. But yeah, the stretch, I've seen it both ways. I've seen them short stretch and I've seen them overstretch, and there's problems with both. The short stretch, obviously, if you don't make it to the fire, it gets ugly. We have to stop everything and then fill it in, or have the backup line come in. And if you overstretch, I've seen that where they don't know where to put the hose. I mean, there's so much hose that they're putting into people's apartments, and it becomes a mess. And then you have too many lengths, which is causing more engine pressure, more friction loss, more kinks,
Right.
ad infinitum. Yeah. So what we try to teach the guys, first of all, they like to put the most senior guy in the engine on this control position. He's the guy. Other cities call him hookup. I think in Boston they might call him hookup. He's the guy that kind of works with the chauffeur, right? And we're kind of unique in a way where our engines, they grab a hydrant and they get their own water, and they do everything for themselves. There's no relying on the second engine or whatever. So it's incumbent upon the control man to guesstimate the length from the rig to the front entrance, right? So that's a number, right? And then what's the length needed from the front entrance to the base of the stairwell, right? Because we have some H types where, especially, they're like multi wings, where you could have 3 lengths just to the base of the stairs. That's another factor, right? So you go 2 and then maybe 3, so now you're up to 5. The biggest piece of information that has to be gotten to the control man is whether or not the stairwell contains a well, right? A well is the area between the banisters where, if you wanted to, you could
Drop
bring
a
the hose
line.
up,
Right.
right?
Right.
So if there is a well, that cuts the stretch down from 1 length per floor to like 1 per 5, right? So that's another equation, right? So now, if there was a well in this building, now 2, 3, 4, we're already up to 6, right? Then we want 1 for the fire floor and then 1 for the apartment. Like I always used to tell my guys, give me an extra one just in case. That's like the perfect world. So a lot of it is just knowing your buildings, knowing, right, the biggest piece of information is whether or not there's a well. Because if there's no well, now you're adding another 5 lengths if the fire is up on the 5th or 6th floor, And I got a lot of pushback. I was a big fan of using the rope. We had plenty of buildings where windows would face the courtyard, and I remember back in, when we had a lot of vacant building fires, that there was you couldn't stretch up the stairs because they were gone. Like all there was like the metal treads, and sometimes that was even suspect. So I saw lots of rope stretches from like the floor below, or and coming up that way. So, but the big thing is knowing your buildings.
Yeah, and that's a big thing. So we talk about knowing your buildings these days, and I think a lot of people struggle with understanding, facades and what we used to call makeovers. You get a building, and the building might be 100 years old, but over time, people would put siding on it, even some of that asphalt siding back in the day when I was a kid, especially in, the Bronx is big for that, Brooklyn's big for that. People had asphalt siding on their houses, and then came aluminum siding, and they didn't take that asphalt off. because the big theory there was, oh, more insulation. You know, you get even more insulation. So you got this combustible siding underneath this more combustible, you know, this aluminum siding, and you know, you go tearing that stuff off, and it was a nightmare. You know, you'd be looking at this building, it's just a nightmare building, right?
Mm.
But I think that we have those kinds of problems, inner city problems, but we're also having problems across the country now with almost like hybrid buildings, if you will. You know, back in the day, in all the cities, we had what were called taxpayers, and basically a guy owned a shoe store, or he owned a clothing store, or he owned a, you know, whatever, he owned a shop, and then he lived above it, and but he owned both properties. So the guy might be running a delicatessen, he might be running a soda fountain store, you know, five and dime, and then he lived above it because that paid his taxes. That's why it was called the taxpayer.
Yep.
So the modern day version of that is kind of interesting, where it's, you know, they're building these places for people to live, apartments. Down on the first floor, you know, it's a Starbucks, and it's a, you know, jewelry store and a dry cleaner. So that they're creating these communities, if you will, and then the people are living above it, you know, and it's rentals or it's condos, but they're combustible. It's all wood. It's wood. And depending on where you live, Dugan and I were out in King of Prussia area. It's near Valley Forge, and we're in that area, general area, and we saw one going up. I want to say, Danny, it was over 5 stories anyway, maybe more, and big. And Dugan and I were like just blown away by how massive a job you could get there, right? And then we were really wondering about what kind of sprinkler system was going to be put in, because the requirements, if it's R3, you know, it's just basically the common areas. So the apartments wouldn't necessarily have sprinklers. You may just have sprinklers, you know, in the hallways and such like that. But so we didn't have time to see all of it. But depending on where you live and what, you know, what the code is for sprinklers and whatnot, you could have these fires. And the other thing we're seeing across the country, whether it was Raleigh or Maryland or a couple of places where we've had some really large fires with these things under construction, because they build them, you know, they're big. The one we were looking at in King of Prussia was a big complex, and it was going to be a big, like, community, if you will. But they're also being built in splendid isolation from here and there. And I know you do some volunteer work in other places, and occasionally to help out training and such, and you see these buildings. So, you know, when you're out, you know, working with people, trying to help them understand fighting fire better, what do you know, so what do you think some of the problems we're facing coming down the road are going to be in regards to these types of buildings, and how do we get ahead of that? Because as you said, you got factories, you've got residential, you've got H buildings, you've got standalones, you've got, you know, the modern fire environment. You know, it used to be people always know your buildings. Well, if you're living in an area that's got a lot of very similar buildings, or if you're only in a residential area, or if you're only in an apartment, good for you. But there aren't many districts like that anymore. You know, it's the types of buildings in an average district could be, you know, literally nowadays, you know, dozens. You know, when you think of renovated, you know, restored, brand new, and such.
Yeah. I saw one. Geez, just last Sunday was it? I was driving home, and it was one of the county above where, you know, where I work, and I saw this 5-story wooden structure. I was just like, wow, like I didn't think you could do that, you know.
Well, they're building wood high rises again. They've built
Yeah,
one, building them.
yeah. You know what makes me nervous about this stuff is that, first of all, the people that are designing these buildings aren't in the fire service, you know.
No.
So it's all about money and using.
Well, the other thing is now it's about sustainability, because they claim that the carbon footprint for one of these wood buildings is less damaging to the environment than a
Right,
steel and concrete building.
right.
When it catches fire, I'll show you a carbon footprint.
Wow. Well, what I've noticed, I noticed, I would say would be I guess it was in the 90s, right? The early 90s when they started building all these lightweights in my area. And they looked great going up, you know. I mean, the sheetrock, 5/8, double 5/8, fireproof, and you know, and they swore to us that, you know, these are fireproof. They're sprinkled and all that. And then, you know, 20 years later, you know, you're going into these buildings and they're a wreck. You know, the sheetrock is there's holes in it, and you know, it's just the places are falling apart. You know what I mean? It's just 20 years of wear and tear in this types of neighborhood. You know, and I'm just thinking to myself, like, the guys, they look pretty on the outside. They really do. I mean, nice, pretty, but inside, you know, they were a wreck. You know, and I'm saying if this is the mindset of people living in these places, like, you know, nothing's going to change. I mean, so it really, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's more contingent on pride of ownership type of thing. Like, if, you know, if people are going to take care of their buildings, because if they don't take care of them, inherently, these wooden buildings, you know, once they start deteriorating, they're going to be a big problem. You know?
Well, I was wondering too, the connections in them. Like a lot of these buildings
Yeah.
are using these glue lam beams. They're using, and I don't know, what the code is going to be for what type of wood they're going to be allowed to use,
Yeah.
but it's going to be very interesting. I know they built one in Canada. I believe it's 18 stories. It's all wood, and it's a dormitory at a college campus. And we all know that college kids are extremely careful with how they use
Yeah.
candles and things like that. They're notoriously fire wise.
Yeah.
So, yeah, yeah. I mean, talk about a population that could have a problem, right? Plus, you have a wild party some night, and the kids are perhaps a bit under the weather. I've heard that young people in Canada enjoy beer. I can't prove that. It might just be a nasty rumor, but it's what then, right? So I think there's some interesting stuff going on. So I think these the issues with buildings is really interesting. So one of the things I know you're real familiar with, I want to pick your brain on a little bit, is divided privates, right? And so you got these private dwellings, and suddenly that's multifamily, right? Normal back in the day it was one family.
Yeah.
Now it's two families,
Mm.
and you may have side by side doors, which is great, but not always. They might be using the rear entrance. They might be, the entrance could be disguised in some way or hidden or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So we see it in privates, and we're also seeing it tragically. We've got a horrible example of it in not commercial, but in multiple families, where they're now building apartments within apartments. You know what I mean? And some of this stuff is happening under the wire. And as we run into, we're going to have some hard times ahead of us. I mean, the economy is not going to come back like a freight train, and overnight everything's going to be normal. There's going to be
Right.
a curve, and so there are going to be unscrupulous people who, are going to want to get rid of buildings and such. And some of those types of buildings are going to be the first to go, because
Right.
of the characters that are doing these kinds of things. If they're creepy enough to do an illegal addition or an illegal renovation, they're creepy enough to have it removed by
Yeah.
fire. So, what's some of your advice for recognizing these things?
Yeah. That's really that's that's so difficult because I found one. It was a few weeks ago. They were loading up our box. They were getting numerous calls and got on scene, and it wound up. It was a kitchen fire. Just we call it food on the stove, right? So I don't know what possessed me to go into the apartment, but I wanted to go in and just take a look. And it was 4 or 5 rooms. They were all locked, had padlocks on them. They were all SROs, and that's really common. And we're not allowed to inspect these buildings because they're private. They're privately owned. We can only inspect the public areas of a building, like the hallways, the roofs, the basements, but we can't get into people's apartments. And that's a big problem for us.
I
Is
bet.
And not only that, in some of the areas, they'll rent the same room to two people and they'll split it. Like, you know, one guy will take it during the day and then the other guy, he goes to work and then the guy comes back at night. So you have all this transient in and out, and then they have hot plates in there and they love candles and, you know, so, you know, there's just this massive overcrowding into a space that's only supposed to be for one family. Now you're getting, God, you know, how many people in it. So I would say, you know, the first thing is try to recognition, and we only get lucky sometimes if we get a water leak or, you know, electrical emergency or gas leak, then we get in there, then we recognize it. But unless we, you know, medical calls are big now. You know, I would say that with the medical calls, we're getting into more apartments that we've never gotten into before. And that whole thing changed. Like when I came on a job, it was the truck companies that got into the apartments all the time for the water leaks, the gas leaks, the food on the stove, all that stuff. And the engine would wait in the street. Now it's the other way around. So the engines are getting in there for the medical calls, you know. And, you know, now they're calling me, hey, Chief, you know, I was at this building and we saw SRO, you know, we saw this illegal partition, you know, like the Black Sunday, you know. We get into the stuff now when it's not on fire, which is helpful. So as much as we don't, you know, we're not thrilled about doing all these medical calls, there is an upside to it for us. And we're getting into all our buildings that we never got into before. And legally, you know, like, you know, it's not like I said, like, you know, we're not allowed in apartment houses into people's apartments, but if they call us for anything and we're in there, then it's fair game, you know. So that's all we can do, really. I mean, other than that, we just have to kind of wait till we're legally allowed to get in there. I can guess, though. I tell you, I know certain areas. I could just tell that. I could look at a building and know there's SROs. I don't know what it is about it. You know, you could look at, like you said, the private dwellings. Like we have a bunch in my area that were built as private dwellings. There were brownstones, and now there's 3 families or 4 families in there. You'll see the meters outside.
Right.
You know, where there used to be 1, there's now 4.
Or mailboxes.
Mailbox is another thing, right? So, yeah, we just have to be like detectives.
Because the problem with that is, you know, we've always relied on, like, to take a brownstone. They're laid out pretty routinely.
Yep.
But when they're subdivided, all bets are off.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so, you know, to me, you know, you suddenly are facing a wall where there should have been a hallway. And
exactly right. Yeah.
You know, what the hell now, right?
Yeah.
Especially if you're trying to, so say, you know, say you have somebody send you out of the rear and they're doing outside vent or whatever. They might be doing outside vent, but where you are,
right, nothing.
It's no use because you ain't getting any benefit from that. That's not, you know, you don't have an exhaust area if you're going to try to, you know, it's just, it gets really interesting when you talk about tactics on those buildings, and because now you're all jammed up. You can't say, oh, here's the floor plan. We know that. This is what they are. No.
Yeah, we had one a month ago. And here's another problem with the brownstones, right? And I still can't get my head around it. When I was studying, coming up the ranks, you know, with brownstones, we called the cellar. The basement was also interchangeably known as the first floor. The second floor was known as the parlor floor. And then everything else above that is the, whatever it is, 3rd, 4th, or 5th floor. But so we had this fire, and I came in on the 2nd alarm, and I went up only 3 steps. I gave a report. I said, battalion to command. I said something about I think we have extension on the 1st floor, and I was corrected. I said, no, we're using that as a 2nd floor. So I'm like, all right, so this is the 2nd floor. So like, we all have to be on the same page, you know, and
terminology changing.
Yeah, and so it turned out though in the basement or the 1st floor, there was a wall that they had put up. So the engine, they couldn't make it down the stairs. They should have came down because it was all filled up with debris and whatnot. So they had to go through the building, come down the interior stairs. They made a right, and they didn't know the wall was there, and they passed it. And now the fire is burning behind them. So so what you said is it's scary stuff with these alterations because
Great.
oh crap, let me get this guy. Oh crap.
That's all right.
Oh no, this is a guy I worked with. He broke me in. He was a super fireman. This guy, he's actually in like my book. He's probably in 3 of the chapters. He's like the star, But anyway,
Oh, wow.
so yeah, I mean, it's just alterations in these brownstones are really,
And I think
you know,
it's creeping into the burbs too. I think people need to be on the lookout for it. It's not, it's not just an inner city problem anymore. It's everywhere. I was out in Bergen, New Jersey, and just goofing around with some guys. It was either Teaneck or it was Fair Lawn or one of those jobs there. Great guys too, and they were showing me, you know, privates, and the guy says 4 families in that house, chief. I'm like, whoa. So they've broken it up into 4 apartments. That means 4 little kitchenettes, 4, dryer vents, 4, so it just, it's not an inner city problem. It's not just that we're seeing in places where you've got high density. You could be seeing it, you could be out, anywhere in America now and see that happening. And you're going to see more of it, right? As more and more, if the economy contracts as much as it looks like it may, and a lot of young people are going to be moving back in, families are going to be consolidating because
look at my house.
okay, you've done that.
I got 2 living at home now.
Okay, well, so there you go. But you may have 2 with children then, and
Yes.
and depending on how fast it goes back into into full production, they could be there for a while. You may end up, you
Yeah.
may end up with, you're going to do a search in a home where you think, okay, I'm going to have 4 people, 6 people. No, you got 10, you got 12, you got 15,
Yeah.
and that's a big day. I mean, I think it's just that the fire service needs to be aware of what's going on in the community all the time. You got to be aware of what's going on inside the fire department, inside the firehouse. You got to be aware of what's going on in the community. You got to know your communities, right? You got to know what the pain points are. There's so much to know. There's so much to learn, and that's why I think that what I enjoy is that those well-rounded people, and I always like telling the story about being down in Katrina, where you're down in Katrina and they're looking for a guy who could set up a relay operation. Everybody's looking around like, oh, and there's a bunch of FDNY guys, and Danny says, oh, I got this. And he sets up a relay operation like he'd been living in Nebraska. No disrespect to Nebraska, but you know what I mean? Like he'd been working in a rural fire department his whole life. And people are looking like, where did you learn this stuff, right? Because he also works at jobs that don't have little yellow plugs. So you're giving the boss is looking for you. We can wrap it up. I say, I know you got some stuff to deal with, so I'm gonna let you go. I know the boss is giving you the heads up.
That's cool.
But just real quick to close it out.
No, but let me go. You said something really that I never thought about, and
What's that?
I got to start thinking about this stuff. You're right. Families are consolidating now. So I'm looking at a place. Now I'm thinking private dwelling, and now grandma's upstairs. The kids are downstairs with, like, I'm not thinking about this. Like there could be 3 families in it.
You got to be.
Wow. That's a aha moment there. Yeah.
And remember, that means a lot more vacants.
Yeah.
So now you're going to have more people in tighter spaces and more vacants. And those vacants, we all know what happens there.
Yeah.
They're just a place for mischief. The gypsies get in there. Next thing you know, the circus is in town. So, you just we gotta be thinking like that, right? I don't care where you are. This was not what's interesting about this thing we're in right now is we all have skin in the game. You could be in the most remote part of America, you got people who shut you down, and that means that when people get shut down, so if you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're in hot water right now, and I understand that lifestyle. We're right there, you know what I mean? Firefighters are not, especially retired firefighters, are not wealthy people, you know what I mean? And when it gets sporty, it gets sporty quick, and so we're in those times, and I really think that we need to be having those discussions, and not that we attribute bad motives to people, but when people get desperate, people get desperate.
Yeah, this happened pretty quick. I can't believe, I still can't believe we're going through this right now.
Right,
Like
but you
just
got to wrap your
a
head
month
around it,
ago.
right? You can't ignore what the ramifications of it are going to be. You know what I mean? And then the other thing to think about too is that a lot of these folks, and I'm going to let you go, but remember they were grabbing toilet paper, they were grabbing fuel too. So you got a lot of bozos that got garages and outbuildings filled with Jenny jugs and all kinds of things with gasoline and such. And you know, you better be thinking that way. You know what I mean? And if
Very
you're
good.
not,
Good point. Yeah. I
if
mean,
you're not,
what's going on
you're
outside?
a knucklehead. You know, you're a knucklehead. So
Yeah.
final thoughts from Danny Sheridan while we wrap this out. And
Yeah.
what's next? I know you're working on a book. I know you have a couple of ideas. Danny and I've been bouncing book ideas off one another now for a
Right.
while. Danny's got one in the hopper. I got one in the hopper.
Yeah.
Other than that, what's on the horizon, Danny?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, Gustin likes it too. I spoke to Bill the other day, and he's loving this idea about this other idea. So for me, they're making a bunch of deputy chiefs. I understand, and I'm getting closer. So on a personal front, um,
Wow.
maybe within a year or two, hopefully less than 2 years, I could be getting promoted to deputy chief. And I've been a battalion chief for a long time now, so I'm ready for the change. I'll be 59 in June, so hopefully by the time I'm 60, 61, I just like to do it. Just to say, get it. Um, um, yeah, finishing up the book, Parables. Actually, I'm just doing the final edits. I talked to Chris yesterday, and just working on getting some pictures for it now, that's the hard. It seems like the hardest part of the book. Writing the thing is just like being a reporter, but now trying to go out and find pictures to
You ought
support
to
this.
reach out. I talk to Mitchell all the time. He's always got great shots. You ought to talk to Lloyd, see what he's got for you.
Lloyd, yeah, that's a good idea. I will reach out to him actually.
Lloyd's got an incredible library, man. He's always over that city he's like Batman, man. If
Yeah,
something
that's right.
happens, they put the Lloyd Mitchell light up off of Gotham, and
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
on it, bro.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. You're right. I should get in touch with him. Yeah, I know we had a bunch of guys in the
Plus, he's
'80s.
plus he's just a freaking great guy. I mean,
Yeah,
he's just a great guy.
yeah. I will reach out to him. That's a good idea, Bob. Yeah. So I'm just wrapping up the book. And on a personal front, just waiting for see what happens with this promotion, and enjoying life.
Well,
you
good.
know.
Well, good. Well, Danny, thanks for visiting with us today at the National Fireman's Journal. We appreciate having you. If you like these conversations, click that little subscribe button. We'd appreciate it. Let you know when we put a new one up there. If you got any thoughts down the road, I know we'll be talking to Danny when his book comes out as we get closer to FDIC and some other things we're putting together. Danny is a member of our advisory board. So if you're in the New York area and you want to become a writer or a speaker, reach out, get a hold of Danny. Danny, how can people get a hold of you?
Well, they could do the Twitter thing. It's the DPS Sandman on Twitter, and Danny Sheridan on Instagram and Facebook. I have them all the three covered, and my email is just my name, Daniel P. Sheridan at Gmail.
There you go.
Always
All right.
happy.
Daniel P. Sheridan at Gmail or Twitter or Facebook. And Danny
Always
always
get
puts
back.
up some interesting things on Twitter and Facebook. He puts up some nice fire problems from time to time. He'll see something. The other day, he showed a picture of a building that him and Bobby Kanabi bailed out of, which I thought was a great picture. And then it also turned up in Tommy's webcast, Tommy Dunn's webcast, which I thought was hysterical.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Good stuff.
All right, buddy. I got some things to deal with at home today, so
I understand, man. Give my thoughts to the family on that, if you would.
Thank you.
That's always tough to go through. So, especially the wife, let her know.
Yeah, I will. Thank you.
Tell her I cut it short just for her, so she doesn't yell at me next time I see her. So.
Okay.
All right, Danny. Love you, brother.
Love you too.